So today we're going to hear from our old friend David Swenson, who has a PhD and an LP. What that means is that he's very smart and he has a long playing record. So that's very good. He is a professor and former director of the MBA in rural health. He's also organized lots of local events having to do with drinking beer, but also having to do with discussing systems and how they interact and how we need to think much more in a much more sophisticated way about the problems that confront us. One of the things he's very familiar with is the early plague, which he will tell you all about today. And if you want, at the end, you might ask him to explain his middle initial, which is the letter X. Some might think that it's related to my cousin, Malcolm Little, who changed his name to Malcolm X because he didn't want to honor his slave owners. But I think you have a very different story if you ask David about the X in his name. In any event, he will tell us about the Black Plague just to cheer us up at this time, and please turn your attention thusly.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate that. I'll go into the X a little bit later. This is a topic that's really been fascinating for me for a long time as a psychologist, as well as working in healthcare, health and human services. I've been intrigued with emergency services for most of my 50 years in the field. I've always been a history buff. I majored in history as one of my majors in college. And about 25, 28 years ago, when I've been at St. Scholastica during a good chunk of that time, I sat in on a colleague's course on medieval economics. And Tony Barrett, who some of you know in the community, is an economist. He did his dissertation on the topic, and I was fascinated with that because it's such a clear, contained event that changed Western civilization. And there's so many moving pieces in that came together that it really captured my imagination. I've read everything I can lay my hands on since then. And the most interesting part is that it seems to parallel other kinds of outbreaks and events. And I think it has, to some extent, a message about what we're doing in our current pandemic. So with no further ado, let me share my screen. And by the way, we have a nice small group here. So anytime you have questions or comments, if you'd like to do that, I think there should also be time at the end when we can talk about this a lot. What I'd like to do is share with you what I see as sort of the dynamics of the Black Death in Europe. And then at the end, because it had such an impact on Western civilization, have us discuss where we see COVID having impact over the future of the United States, maybe the world. Some of your perspectives on that. What do you see going on? So let me share my screen here. I hope you can all see that. And the theme is, what have we learned then? What have we learned now about that? And let me get into, there we go. I'd like to talk about how the Black Death came about, because it wasn't a single cause. It was a whole landscape, a whole matrix of different kinds of factors, any one of which, if it had not been present, might not have had exactly the same consequence. But it's one of the things that I think is interesting, because we often just look at the most prominent thing in front of our face and try to solve that, when in fact there was this whole landscape. And I think much of this landscape, this idea of looking at things from a connected or a complexity or a systems point of view, is exactly what we're dealing with right now. And again, at the end of the presentation, I'd really like to get a conversation going among all of us. How will this pandemic change our country and the world, and what are our thoughts on that? Again, it's our curse, I think. We're really good at analysis. We're really good at identifying, prioritizing problems. And we see the problem in front of our faces, and that's what we latch on to. Just recently, for example, with the pandemic, just about everybody is on board saying, hey, telehealth is great. It'll give people access. We can get immediate responses. The electronic health record is going to be transferable, on and on and on. Just recently, though, there's been a spate of articles in the literature talking about the unintended consequences and unintended problems of telehealth. So on the one hand, like the electronic health record, it seems like just the neatest thing since sliced bread until we start thinking about the downstream effects of actually implementing it. And in the case of the Black Death in Europe and our current pandemic, we kind of look at what's in front of us. Well, let's get a vaccine and let's socially isolate. But in fact, it's a very complex set of factors. Not only that, but there are a lot of moving parts in it. And we need to understand the dynamic nature of a pandemic, not just what is the most apparent part of that. Let me give you sort of an overview of where we're going with this. In about 1331 in China, where the Mongols had and the Great Khan had conquered, there was the beginnings of the undoing of the Mongolian Empire. They had started expanding throughout essentially all of China, and then they began moving into Mongolia. And they encountered the bubonic plague primarily in Mongolia. I'll go into some of the detail on that. But over the next 3 years, it spread throughout Europe at a fantastic rate. It killed 30 to 50% of the entire population of Europe. Some people say it was even higher than that. And some towns and cities were completely wiped out. And it was not just one event. From the 14th century all the way to the 17th century, there were multiple waves of that. And I'll show you a couple maps that plague is still present in many locations in the world, including the United States. The impact of that was phenomenal. Every aspect of Western civilization, relationships and politics, economy, technology, all of these change drivers were influenced by the pandemic. And there are a lot of parallels still in the modern world. So let's kind of go back to the beginning with this. The Mongol horde was expanding its influence, and they were incredibly successful. They started moving through Mongolia, which are these huge expanses of plains. And the people there, for the most part, were farming sheep. And when the armies came through, they needed supplies. There were hundreds of thousands of Mongol warriors, and so they grabbed the sheep. They also lived off the land. And the little marmot that you see in the right-hand corner was one of the major carriers of lice that carried the Yersinia, or the Yersinia pestis flea that carried the bacterium. The farmers and the herdsmen in Mongolia, they knew not to eat the marmots during certain times of the year because people died. But when the Mongol horde came through, they simply disregarded that. They needed the food. They needed to move on toward Europe. And so they took all these sheep with them that had been infected, and gradually the army itself was infected. You can see here how they moved out of China, and there were several different pathways. One down here through Persia. It was amazing that they were successful with that, because much of the time the caravans moved so slowly that they would have simply died out. But it's this northern branch as well as the southern branch that came together on the Black Sea and the port of Kaffa that things really literally took fire. The Mongol horde was already experiencing tremendous deaths and numbers of illness. They had surrounded Kaffa for a couple of years already. The city was holding out. They had a seaport, they had food, they had high walls. They were defending themselves quite well, while the Mongols were dying by the hundreds and thousands. Recognizing that they were in a bad position, what they finally did, which was one of the first examples of biological warfare, is they put, this is a catapult here, you can see the counterweight to it, and they put bodies of dead and dying, swollen bodies, swollen with the plague, and they catapulted them over the wall. A swollen body is pretty fragile. It tends to splatter. And so that bacterium was all over the walls and inside the gates. And within just a few days, people started coming down with plague inside Kaffa. Well, you had mariners and you had tradespeople and merchants and all sorts of folks. You also had a port. And so people began evacuating Kaffa, taking the plague with them. And you can see here in general form where they went from Kaffa to Baghdad, they went to Constantinople, and from there to Cyprus and Alexandria. Then they went to Italy, which is the main impact on Europe, and it spread from there. Now, again, many people, even a few years before, they probably would have died at sea. But just a few years before the plague hit Kaffa, the Genoese developed new hulls that would make their ships sail faster. They developed new sails. These innovations allowed the ships to sail much, much faster, and thereby spread the disease to all these different ports. Here's an example of the vectors of spread, and you can see how quickly it moved throughout all of Europe, from Russia and Finland and England and all these different countries. And it essentially was spread in the beginning by the army and then by the travelers on the ocean. But then people started escaping. They started escaping Marseille, for example, and Genoa, and especially Florence, hoping to avoid the plague. But most of the time they took it with them and infected much of the rest of Europe. Not a whole lot different than people who maybe are in Texas or Alabama or other places, and they say, you know, the spread is just too great here, it's too dangerous. I think I'll go up to my cabin in Minnesota. Or they're simply denying that it's that serious, and they're going to go ahead and cluster together simply because they don't believe it's an issue. Or as in many of the Asian and especially the Arabic countries, it's the will of God. There's nothing we can do about it. Let's go ahead with our daily practices. Well, here's a way of thinking about it, how things are connected. One of the things that isn't talked very much about is climate change and how climate increased competitive pressure for economic expansion. And as a result, they developed a lot of new east-west trade routes, both by land and by sea. And as I mentioned before, the water routes and the speedier vessels allowed that rapid transmit. One of the major products were spices and grains and these large cargo ships that rats love. And so when these ships landed in the various ports, the infected crews and the cargoes and the rats with the lice, with the infection, spread that disease very quickly through those ports. The one thing, again, that is not talked about too much is the impact of climate. And in fact, I mentioned to some of you in various conversations over the last few weeks, I'm involved in a couple different healthcare summits. And I've just been so impressed how people have become preoccupied with the pandemic, which is something that's really important. But after the pandemic is over, something that people are not talking about much at all is the impact of the climate that is even going to have more dramatic impact on our healthcare, on our economy, on all sorts of aspects of our life. But they're, again, looking at what's right in front of them, when in fact climate is a good piece of what's pushing disease vectors to the north. It's increasing migration of very large populations, as we know. It's congesting people in cities and other parts of the country where transmission is a lot easier. Well, back from somewhere around 1300 and also up to about 1850, climate was variable. During one period, it's called the medieval warm period. Population expanded at a phenomenal rate in Europe. Agriculture expanded. It was a wonderful time to be alive, kind of like the time that we've had in the world now, especially in the United States for most of the last 3 generations. But it was followed then by the Little Ice Age. We don't exactly know what caused the Little Ice Age. It could have been due to decreased sunspots and a reduction of solar radiation, maybe a decrease in carbon dioxide, maybe volcanic activity. All those things were operative. We really aren't quite sure about that. But during that medieval warm period, there was a lot of birth, a lot of expansion of the population, a lot of expansion of agriculture. As the little ice age started, the temperatures cooled off. The winters were longer, the summers were wetter. And the agriculture at that time was a lot of grains with shorter summers, wetter summers. And in fact, in 1315, from May to August, rain fell almost constantly. And it rained very heavily for about 5 years. So at a time when they were relying on grain as their primary monoculture, they didn't eat a lot of animals. They relied on grain. Grain fell over in the fields. It rotted in the fields. The livestock didn't have anything to eat. And even the people were eating next year's seed. The price of grain skyrocketed. And so their health level, their resiliency, the ability to rely on a monoculture was terrible. And from 1315 to 17, about 1.5 million people died with repeated famines throughout the system. So there was a lot of vulnerability at that point. Some glaciers began engulfing some of the mountain villages. And if any of you have been looking at climate now, the glaciers have receded as we have not seen in our history before. They needed more firewood, so they began deforesting areas, and they moved agriculture into those areas that never would have been designed for agriculture. So they were kind of desperate. At that time, we know that art kind of reflects the land, and even part of the English Channel was frozen over during that time. The winter landscape here near a castle, and the snow theme by Peter Bruegel, Hunters in the Snow by Bruegel. These were the themes because it was cold, and that too interfered with agriculture, it interfered with lifestyle, and it sort of portended what would happen in the near future. In agriculture, and you can see from the upper map, as families got larger, typically what they did was to give parcels of land primarily to all the sons. But as you go generation after generation, the parcels had to get smaller and smaller, and the sons went out and they started going into marshy areas and into swamps and into deforested areas that really weren't very productive. And so productivity dropped off. Also at this time, peasants were working the land. They had no rights. They paid in food for their rent, so they often didn't have sufficient food. Gradually, when it became apparent that this was not going to work, they only provided land to the eldest son. What do the others do? Well, they would marry earlier in order to try to get land, because if you had a family, you could get land. But they also started migrating to the cities. Now, this is very similar to what has happened recently in Syria. The drought in Syria, even though that didn't cause the Syrian revolt and rebellion that we're seeing now, cattle were dying in the field. Farmers couldn't grow crops, so they went into Damascus, where they couldn't get jobs, and that simply added to the rebellion that was going on. Similar kinds of things where people would be congested. You can see here again some of the maps where the land was broken into successively smaller sections that were simply untenable. You could not feed a family on that. And given the climate crisis, even if you had land, it wasn't always productive. Rural life itself really posed a lot of problems with rats and infections. As many of you know who've studied history, they didn't have barns at the time, and they didn't have heating and air conditioning at the time. What they would do would be to bring their pigs and chickens and cattle into the bottom level of their houses, and the body heat from the animals would rise, and the people would sleep in the loft area, and they would be warmed by the body heat. You also look at that daub and wattle construction of the buildings. They'd have a lot of thatch and a lot of sticks and a lot of mud on the outside, but sometimes it was hollow on the inside, and rats would get up inside of that. And all the thatch on the roof was also a lovely place for rats to live. Now, that probably wasn't as much of a problem until the plague started spreading, and the rats were a primary vector of that. And so you could see that under these circumstances, people were directly exposed to the animals and especially the rats. There was also terrible sanitation and hygiene at this time. People actually did not believe in washing. They believed it was ungodly. They believed it would actually open their pores to illness. And in the cities, you know, one of the things that we don't do as much anymore, but I know all of us as older folks can remember when a gentleman walks a lady down the street, you hold her arm and you walk on the outside. Why do you walk on the outside? Because people in these old days would open their window and they'd throw night soil out the window, and all that urine and fecal material would come flying down. You wouldn't want it to hit a lady. Gentlemen would take the hit. In addition, that stuff would pile up in the streets. Pigs would eat it, the cattle would track it around, people would track it around, the carts would come through and splash it, and that fine gentleman would take the splash that would come on it. So a lot of traditions have unknowingly come from the way people dealt with the god-awful sanitation back then and the close quarters that people had. Well, here's the mechanism of it. The mice itself and the rats would be infected with that, and the flea would jump to humans. The interesting thing is that the flea would bite the humans, but the flea often had its whole digestive system blocked by the bacteria. And so it would try to bite and draw blood from the humans, but because it couldn't swallow that, it would regurgitate, it would vomit the blood back up into the open wound it had made, but it also has the bacteria in it. And the humans infected, other fleas would bite the human, carry the bacteria, it would multiply in the flea's gut, and then it would recycle. And the rats and the humans then would essentially keep propagating that. Well, this is kind of a busy slide, but one of the things that I tried to do in my course several years ago and has continued to influence me is looking at how are all these things related. And this is actually a simple map of the factors that came together. This is what I believe we really need to start thinking about with our current COVID pandemic. We need to understand the different factors that come together to make us vulnerable. So back then, climate change, longer winters, wetter seasons, a lot of flooding, shorter growing period and climate, that led to poor production, lower wheat yield and crops, no grape culture, grain wouldn't ripen, lower seed yield. And as a result, the animals died, people had poor nutrition, which contributed to people's susceptibility to the disease. The animal famine back then led to less manure fertilizer and poor production. At the same time, there were a lot of innovations. There were some new crops. There was 3-field rotation. The heavy plow was developed and ox teams were shared. Horse harness, the windmill, the horseshoe. All of this allowed people to be, at least initially, more productive in agriculture. And so the settlement pattern involved a sorting, which was breaking up the lots of land into smaller areas, reclaiming land areas that probably never should have been grown, and the inheritance, which increased the likelihood that people wanted to marry earlier so they could get land. That increased the birth rate and population. It increased the land use. All of that started limiting the land. Land was more limited. They were using more poor land, erosion, clearing forests, and draining the swamps and marshes that again added to the poor production. The increased birth rate led to that migration in towns and cities, population congestion, and ungodly sanitation. And that, in addition to the social pressures of the gap between the rich and poor, low wages, restrictive guilds, and public revolts led to more migration. And all of these combined led to greater susceptibility to the disease. So when plague presented itself, people were really ripe for it. It's this kind of thinking, not just what's in front of your face, but what led to that, and what led to that, and what led to that, is the way we need to start thinking about these connections. Well, we called it the Black Death because a lot of different reasons. Charles mentioned the Black Death course in what is it, the Great Courses Online. It's a 24-28 series that is absolutely marvelous. I always thought the Black Death was called that because of the necrosis of the body, the blackness of the fingers and toes, but it wasn't. The word black back then meant disastrous and devastating. So it was used as a metaphor. Black Death was the awful, evil death. And then later on, about in the 1700s, that's where they started talking about the black being related to the buboes and necrosis. But there's 3 different ways in which the Black Death was contracted. One was direct contact. Now, this is really similar to Ebola in Africa. When a family member would die, it's their culture to get the body, for the whole family to gather around the body, to wash the body, to kiss the body. Well, now everybody's got Ebola in the family. Back then, these swollen lymph glands on the underarm, the groin, the neck, called buboes, and these would swell, and the vessels would break, cause internal bleeding, and that congestion then would turn black. People would have terrible muscle aches and headaches, fever and chill, exhaustion, nausea, vomiting. And if the buboes would burst, as they sometimes would, or sometimes they'd be incised to drain them, it was just a god-awful smell that would literally drive people out of the room, in some cases out of the house. Death in the direct contact would be 4 to 6 days, so about a 75% mortality rate, something we just have not seen in modern day culture. The spread was slow with the direct contact. It had to be person to person until it changed. Septicemic is when people would get direct blood infection. Now think, in those days, they didn't understand about bacterial transmission. There was a lot of people working. In fact, everybody probably worked with their hands, even the scholars. Get a paper cut, for example. But the point is, people had a lot of open injuries, and that's they would get the septicemic. In this case, vomiting, bleeding from their eyes and nose and ears, bruising, organ bleeding, shock. The body would simply shut down and gangrene would form. The death rate was nearly 100%, and people would die in 1 to 3 days. Imagine what that was like. Overall, in the culture, parents would not name their children until they were about age 5 because they expected them to die. And finally, the worst version of it is pneumonic plague. And this is one that we still sometimes see even in the United States, especially in Western states related to rodent contagion. And this had very quick onset, very high fever and chest pain. You'd be frothing at the mouth with bloody sputum. The lungs would essentially fill up, which would be the pneumonia part of it. 90 to 95 mortality and failure within about 2 days, and it spreads very rapidly. Very much like COVID in congested areas where it's an aerosol. Well, the people in charge at the times, both the physicians, the clergy, the leadership, recognized how devastating this was. So they called the Paris Concilium in 1348, and they pulled together people of knowledge, and they agreed that the real cause would not be known. I mean, they thought they were being smited, to go back to Dave's key words that he found. They thought we were being smited because of all the evil in the world. But they didn't stop there. They looked at all different kinds of possibilities. And remember how much magical thinking there was at that time. Some of the proposed causes, excuse me, some of the proposed causes is that the planets were aligned in a way that it must cause a disturbance in the atmosphere. It's where malaria or mal air, bad air, the idea came from. It's got to be something in the air. Or it's the will of God. And especially in Islamic countries, it was just tragic because they believe it's the will of God. There's nothing we can do about that. And so they went about their daily task and they died in huge numbers. In Christian as well as Islamic areas, it's the work of the devil. But especially in the Christian West, it must be moral contamination. We've failed in our obligation to the Lord, and we must be punished for it. In other cases, they thought it must be earthquakes releasing fumes, hot weather, or again, bathing, opening the body pores to infection. This was a very, very dirty time in Western history. People just did not believe in washing. The one that I think was interesting, lust in old women. Well, we're damp now, aren't we? Overeating, a moist temperament based on the idea that the humors of the body must be out of balance, and then corruption of the air, manure, garbage, corpses, or butchers and fishermen. There must be something that they have to do with that. And remember, at that time, we had a very simple way of thinking about it. The humors of the body, phlegmatic and sanguine, melancholic and choleric. The balance of those humors, those moistures, those fluids in the body, that must be doing it. Or maybe the planet. And this was the best understanding that they had at the time. They simply did not understand bacterial infection and viruses and contagion. So they dealt with that as basically as they could. Instead of getting an appointment with your local family physician, you go to the barber. Did you ever think about why they have that barber pole outside with the red and white and eventually the blue striping on it? That's where the barbers would hang their bloody bandages outside the barber shop to dry out. The red and white was the blood on the white bandages. And it was much more than a shave and a haircut. At that time, they would pull teeth and they would blister and purge and leach and cup and put potions and poultices together. Some of you may or may not know that George Washington died by having overly enthusiastic personal physicians. Each came in and wanted to help their beloved president. Each of them bled him and bled him to death. But at that time, it made sense to them. They were ridding the body of evil humors. In addition, they use a lot of herbal medicine. There are magical medicines and herbal medicines and poultices. Unfortunately, those really didn't work a whole lot. But even today, if you go online, you find people who are naturopaths and homeopaths and herbal specialists, and they will have all kinds of cockamamie prescriptions for people that will take care of COVID, so they say. Didn't work back then either. I went through the literature and I put together this phenomenal list of how people tried to cope with the Black Death. The suit you see there is a medieval hazmat suit, basically, and it completely covered the body. That beak that you see was based on the idea that the contagion was caused by bad air. So what they did was have that beak, which in a way kind of filtered stuff out. They didn't know about the filtering, but they filled it with fresh blossoms and flowers, so the sweetness of those blossoms would cancel out the negative effect of bad air. But they had gloves, they had whole body costumes, they had that mask. That's pretty clever in some ways. But if you look at this incredible list of things here, fleeing to safe areas was one of the ways that it got passed on. They had amulets of mercury and lead, and of course we know you start taking, you have contact with mercury on your skin and lead, or you start drinking that, then a good case of dementia and brain damage is going to result. But they also had cautery. They would burn the buboes, which didn't help at all. In London, they believed that dogs and cats were spreading it. So they killed about 70,000 dogs and cats. The rats loved that. The rats just multiplied and spread it throughout London even faster. But sometimes they would drink goat urine, they would smoke tobacco, they would shoot cannons in later on to dispel the mists. They would put the entrails of young puppies or pigeons on the forehead that would draw out the poison. Again, that's not too much different than early America, where they would have young slave children lay on the ground, and if they had gout or other kinds of pain in their feet and legs, they'd put their feet on the young child because the child would absorb the illness. And it went on and on. So, you know, again, people were creative with their best understanding. They would try to find a way to resolve it. This stuff didn't work by and large. Well, what many people did is run to the hills. And I suspect in college, some of you read Boccaccio's Decameron. And one of the quotes in there that I thought was so interesting, the quote of that period is, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die." And so in the Decameron, mainly young people, they would escape to the country, and they would go to country houses, and they would pass time by telling stories. And one of the stories, or one of the phrases, they would eat lunch with their friends and eat dinner with their ancestors in paradise, probably with the pneumonic plague. And in 1348, it started in 1347, and within 3 years it swept through most of Europe. And people were dying in the streets. They did what we see in some other countries, where now they're starting to have mass graves. And finally, they couldn't even put that many people in mass graves because they couldn't find enough people to dig them. So they would pile them up and they would burn them, or they would throw them in the rivers. They throw them in the Thames, and the Thames, the stench was impossible. And you can only imagine what thousands and thousands and thousands of bodies in a river would do over a period of a few weeks. Well, another thing, they considered that obviously they were evil people, and piety would take care of that. And so the most pious people would form these huge processions of what they called flagellants. They would beat themselves. They would punish themselves. God, see how remorseful I am. And in fact, this picture is taken from currently in Indonesia, where as devout Christians and believers, they still scourge themselves. Well, they would travel from town to town, trying to get more adherents, as well as showing that piety was the way to stop the plague. In fact, many of them simply transferred the plague from town to town themselves. Pope Clement VI condemned that practice and actually sent soldiers out to punish and even kill the flagellants. Sometimes that worked, sometimes then the army would come down with it. The worst part of it, and we see that today with many politicians blaming people. You know, it's the Kung flu, the Chinese did it, it was planned. And it's the liberals who, it's a hoax, and it's the liberals who are spreading it around. Back then, anyone who was different, Jews, Muslims, heretics, gay people, witches, vagrants, lepers, prostitutes, foreigners, people who were different were blamed. And the Jews were the ones who in particular were blamed. And the Christians, again, thinking that, well, they are the ones who killed our Savior, must be their fault. And so just as in Nazi Germany, they were given special clothes and badges, they had to live in certain parts of the village, they were often beaten, or the worst cases, the incredible pogroms. For example, in 1349, 12,000 Jews had been tortured, burned alive, or otherwise killed in Bavaria. 12,000 in Toledo, Spain, and on and on. And they would gather them together in pits and burn them alive. The lack of humanity is absolutely stunning. Well, the clergy was involved, and in many cases, initially, they responded by trying to provide solace to people who were infected. As a result, as you see in 1349, huge numbers of priests died. Those that realized that they couldn't save people, they head to the hills too. Now imagine what the impact is on believers when they see that priests themselves, the God-filled men, are dying. That kind of undermines their faith. And the rest of the priests are running to the hills, so they've been abandoned. That's really started part of the Reformation, and it also started to change the role of lay people. Priests who had learned Latin were dying off, and so after the plague was over, one of the trends was for lay people to come in and use vernacular rather than Latin. Women also came in at the time and had much more of a role in the church. I'm hearing some music in the background. Someone might want to check their the background and see if they can close that out. In any case, let's go back to this. The mortality rate was just phenomenal. Overall, somewhere between 30 and in some places up to 75% of people died. Over 5,000 sheep died in one pasture. You're not going to bury them. You're going to leave them out there. Whatever eats them is also going to get infected. And it's also a misbelief that the Great Death, the Great Pestilence, the Great Mortality, the Black Death that went by different names was one event. It was never one event. If you look down the left-hand side, from 1300 to 1399 in Europe, there were 27 different epidemics. From 1700 to 1799, 32 different epidemics. It goes up into 1867 with a recurrence of the plague. And over on the right hand, you can see some of the different death rates. In Moscow, 1570, 200,000 people died. Phenomenal. Well, again, with all the creativity, human beings really do have good intentions. There were scientists of the time. There were good physicians at the time. They learned a lot. And what they learned, frankly, are things that we're living with today. The idea of passports. Right now, Europe is not accepting people from America because of the risk of Americans who are not taking good care of ourselves. So passports were used to restrict people from coming in. Quarantining, health boards, removing garbage. When I was in China in 1986, I was walking around with my interpreter, and there were these huge piles of garbage. I mean, 8-foot high pyramids of garbage. And one of the things I said with sarcasm in my voice, I said, "There's garbage everywhere." And fortunately, he didn't hear the sarcasm in my voice. And he said very proudly, "Yes, isn't it wonderful? Now we pile it up so it can be removed." Prior to that, it was scattered all over, very much like old Europe. And I had missed that point. I hadn't appreciated that. But garbage removal, urban sanitation, health certificates, washing of our hands, fumigation, cleaning, wiping down the tables and doorknobs that we do today. Isolating different fields where there may be propagation. Unfortunately, they're not doing that in China, where people are, again, in very close proximity to chickens and pigs that are primary hosts and vectors. Death certificates and records. These are things that came out of the Black Death in Europe that we still practice, or on the other hand, that we've forgotten to practice that really work. Here's an example in 1665. So don't think about 1337 when it started. Think about these waves. In fact, for any of you who are in public health or familiar with public health, what you probably know is for the last probably 20 years or so, people in public health have said, we are overdue for a pandemic. We are bound to have a pandemic. And there's been very little attention paid for it until we've now got bitten in our backside. But in 1665, in London alone, there were 62,596 people who died. People who were executed, I can't quite read that, something like 28. People who were frightened to death, 23. The French pox, which is syphilis, about 86. You can see what people died of, and most of them died of the plague. Well, the immediate response to the plague was kind of interesting from a systems view again. The primary response was abandonment and flight and transmission to previously unaffected areas. The religious reaction was piety, flagellance, and scapegoating. That didn't work. A lot of common kinds of methods that were tried didn't work, but out of that eventually, we had those effective methods that from the previous slide. It just takes a while to get there, and apparently it takes people being personally impacted in order for them to change their behavior and look at it differently. Art reflects life, and it's really interesting to use that as kind of an index of what's going on. For the last 20 years, if you look at a lot of popular movies in the United States, pandemics and contagion has been a theme. We've looked at that, we've played with that, and people still think, well, it's just a movie, just making that up. But in the early 1300s, if you look at this kind of painting, light is used, perspective is used, it's three-dimensional figures, there's a sense of social community and so on. By 1348, the figures had taken a flattened view, much more of a mechanical or a wooden presentation. The deity was no longer kind and forgiving and loving, but there was a reality that kicked in here. Things were uncompromising. Death was final. And you got to wonder, is this the beginning of Freethinkers, where they began questioning things? The art of Peter Bruegel, The Triumph of Death, which was his way of saying the Black Plague, showed the devastation and the sense of futility and demoralization that people experienced back then. So the long-term effects of the plague, and this is kind of leading into the conversation I'd like us to have. In art, there was much more realism. There was a daily theme of how things have affected us. In medicine, hospitals were formed. Public health and sanitation, surgery gained its prominence beyond the barbers. Professional ethics and the whole scientific method of observation and hypotheses really took hold. In governments, there were revolts and secular rebellions, lower taxes, and end to serfdom, which meant cheaper land and resources. Wages, people could work for a reasonable wage. Because men died, women took over many of the businesses and work. The peasants were no longer working for a lord, but working for themselves. There were more sophisticated tastes because money was available. People had a little higher standard of living, so they could demand meat. They could demand special fruits and grains and fibers and textiles. In addition to all the grains, they had livestock, and they had a more diversified diet. There was lower industrial production, but it also led to a lot of innovations, most interesting to a sense of urgency. And the religion, there was more poor clergy, there was both less and more religiosity. The church hierarchy was decreased, a decrease in Latin, more vocabulary, more of the vernacular in Latin. Let me try that again. Less Latin and more vernacular in the church. It contributed to the Reformation and women as intercessors in the church, much more prominent for women, and a decrease in the influence of men. But the sense of urgency is really interesting too. If you knew that you were going to die, if you knew that life was limited, no matter how hard you prayed, there's a limited sense of time. They extended the workday. We have to get more work done. There was more night work, emphasis on profits. And that's when clocks really and time consciousness came into its own. Again, the clergy came up with water clocks. And so we began with this work ethic idea and time. It's interesting too that even in the United States, back in the railroad days, every town had its own timetable. It wasn't until the railroads came through and you had to have everything on schedule or you'd miss the train that we actually ended up with time zones, and we had to coordinate those time zones. So necessity is a real mother of invention. And this idea of the work ethic really came again out of the influence of the plague. So we shouldn't get too satisfied with the idea that the plague was really only in 1347 and spread. Because if you look at the cholera pandemic from 1961 to 1991, it was all over the world. If you look at the H1N1 in 2009, it hit the United States pretty well. If you look at the global distribution of plague in 2016, western part of the United States, it was prominent, it was there. And now COVID has really hit us all over the world. And due to our disregard of some of our learnings, it's probably going to stay with us for at least a couple more years. And many people say, nah, it's going to be part of our endemic diseases, same as the Western United States has with plague. So what have we learned from the Black Death? Well, one is a population density in metro states, in metropolitan cities, is where it seems to spread fastest. Safety is related to wealth and poverty, and we have a tremendous gap in this country. We need to work toward justice and more equity. There is an increase in disease-resistant bacteria from our abuse of antibiotics. Although that doesn't affect viruses, it does mean that we aren't paying attention to our misuse of medications. We know that these diseases mutate, and a single solution, we need to keep updating our understanding of it. Climate change exacerbates that risk, and that is the next big change driver when we get COVID out of the way. We'll probably have to pay attention to. It's already devastating many countries. We are cutting into the rainforest. We are cutting into areas of the United States with forestation. We are exposing ourselves to new biothreats. There's global transportation in 24 hours. You can be in Wuhan, China, and then be in New York. The government's overly complex, slow, insufficient, frankly, stupid, and negligent and ignorant way of responding to crises is just devastating. With the Trump administration, they say, we're going to do it, then the government do it, but it's the governor's fault, and then now it's the county's fault, and now we have to do it. They don't know. It's completely uncoordinated. The prominence of fundamentalism and conspiratorial thinking, my hunch, is going to lead to that same kind of blaming. Who are they going to blame? Well, you can blame the liberals, you can blame the Jews, you can blame poor people, but blame game doesn't solve much of anything. It simply adds to the confusion and polarization. Racism and the tendency to blame and have knee-jerk reaction solutions is still what we're doing. Quarantine and isolation work. We've forgotten that. We're not doing that. We're so wrapped up in our own narcissism, and I have the right to be out there and go to the beach when I want to, and you can't impose on me. Well, they actually forget that personal privacy and rights end where public protection begins. One of the hallmarks of public health. And culture trumps, I had to throw that pun in there. It trumps rationality. And I supervise therapists, and I supervise people up on the range in Minnesota. And one of the big frustrations they have is that people in the bars and the restaurants up there, many of them are Trump followers, and they say, this is a hoax. It's BS promoted by the liberals. There's no such thing. And that culture trumps any information that they get about COVID. And so basically, we're not prepared. We've never been prepared. And the question is, how do we deal with things when we keep ignoring what we've learned from the past?